I decided to use the session for is to kind of give a little bit of a twist on expansion in the context of the African continent specifically. I'll talk a little bit about my story, but that's really the main kind of experience that I've gained over the past 10 years. And I'm going to take you through a little bit, kind of who am I, who's Yoco, why is Africa so exciting for us and hopefully for many of you. And then I'll spend the bulk of my time talking a bit about, what makes expansion on the continent particularly challenging, but also particularly exciting. And then, yeah, I hope we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end as well, and super happy to answer any questions. So to dive right in, as Aaron mentioned, I'm Marcello. I lead international expansion at Yoco. I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa now for almost a little over 8 years. But as he mentioned, I'm actually not originally from Africa, and not from South Africa either. I'm from a small town in Austria called Innsbruck. And this is kind of the view I grew up with, which is fantastically idyllic. But if your view is blocked by mountains that are about 2 kilometers higher than you are, it's probably one of the least conducive places to think about expansion, because anything you want to do outside of where you grew up basically includes either climbing 2 or 3 kilometers of mountains or driving around it for 2 hours. So I grew up in a very weird place, or I ended up in a very weird place compared to how I grew up. But yeah, somehow I found myself, found my way over the mountains and onto the continent. And my story with the continent actually started in 2013 when I joined an event called Startup Bus. Maybe some of you are familiar. It's something that's been going in the US for a very long time, where when South by Southwest happens, people get on buses all over the US, meet up in Austin and do a hackathon along the way. And in 2013, a friend of mine thought it would be a really good idea to do Startup Bus in Africa. So he flew 30 entrepreneurs, both from the continent, from outside of the continent, to Harare in Zimbabwe, and put them on a bus to drive all the way to Cape Town, which, if you're driving direct, is about a 26-hour journey. I think we drove for 5 weeks, 5 days, sorry, felt like 5 weeks. But I think what was really special for me about this trip was that along the way, we got the opportunity to stop at a couple of co-working spaces, incubators, startup hubs, and then of course ended up in Cape Town, which is like one of the most vibrant startup ecosystems on the continent. And it was really kind of an epiphany for me to see what's happening in the technology space on the continent, how much opportunity there is to move economies forward, and drive change through technology. And then I kind of fell in love with the region and found ways of staying. And then over the years, through my work at SeedStars and at Yoco, I've now gotten the opportunity to spend time in over 20 countries. I've probably worked with about 2,000 startups all over the continent in some shape or form. But really, for the past 6-7 years, very much focused on Yoco and our growth in South Africa and beyond. So that's just a little bit about myself. 2 things I want to say about Yoco, just to get a sense of who we are and where we fit in, is we are, the simplest way of explaining it is we are the square for Africa, right? So we are really trying to solve the issue of small businesses being underserved by traditional financial institutions when it comes to accepting digital payment methods. And very similar to most other parts of the world, small businesses are really what make up the chunk of GDP, the chunk of employment, the chunk of growth, and the chunk of economies in emerging markets to begin with. And so I found that being in a space where we're serving small businesses is really, really meaningful and really, really special. And so what we started with about 10 years ago is really kind of trying to bridge the gap between small businesses, consumers wanting to pay digitally, and small businesses being able to accept digital payments. And then over the past 10 years, we've grown to about 350,000 merchants who use either our online and offline payments systems, or who use us to get working capital, or use us to get business tools to manage and grow their business. So we're really trying to build this financial ecosystem for small businesses, starting from South Africa and then growing into the rest of the continent. Yeah, I think that's a very short introduction of Yoco. Don't want to make it too much of a pitch, but really get into the heart of the topic. And the way I wanted to structure this is just kind of talk a little bit about the continent first, because of course the audience is from all over the place. I'm not sure how familiar everybody is, so I hope I'm not repeating something for people who are a bit more exposed. And if you're not, I hope it's an interesting, quick introduction into the potential of the region. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about kind of the challenges of expanding. You've probably all heard, Africa is a continent of 1.2 something billion people, which is a number that's used quite frequently to explain the size of the continent, right? And what's super interesting about the continent beyond that is that it's not just the size makes it interesting, but it's also the growth that's really unique. If you look at kind of the fastest growing economies in the world, consistently over the past few years, the majority out of the top 10 fastest growing economies has come from the continent. Different countries at different times, but generally, if you look at the fastest growing countries in the world, over half of them are on the continent. So the growth you see is super, super interesting. On the topic of growth, what's also very interesting is if you look at kind of not just the growth of economies, but the growth of population, what you're going to see is that some of the largest mega cities in the world are going to be in Africa in the next 15 to 20 years, right? Like cities like Lagos and Cairo are going to become cities of 25, 30 million people or more. Cities that today might not be that familiar outside of the continent, like Dar es Salaam or Abidjan or Dakar, are going to be cities that are going to be 5, 10, 15 million people. And so what you're starting to see is you're going to start to see these really, really big mega cities that, and again, I forgot what the exact number is, but I think when the study was done, they were saying that, kind of the majority of the future mega cities are again going to come from the continent. So lots of growth, lots of opportunities, especially if you are looking at kind of urban areas, so to speak. The other thing that I think is super fascinating and really important to note about the continent is that it is by far the youngest region in the world. If you look at this map that shows the median age around the world, you can see that for most of the countries on the continent in green, the median age is below 18. So you have a huge population that is super, super young and is growing quickly, and the economies are growing quickly. So the trends are showing, really big growth, really big potential. Of course, from a relatively low base compared to the rest of the world, which we'll get to in a bit. But if you're looking at kind of the long-term trends and long-term opportunity in the world, I'm of course pretty biased, but many people would believe that Africa is where it's at. So, to overly kind of simplify this is, you've got a large population, high economic growth, and that of course means a huge opportunity for businesses to start on the continent, for businesses to grow into the continent, and for businesses to expand on the continent. Now, that is great. But, as all of you are interested and probably somewhat familiar with expansion, it's not as easy as it sounds. And it's especially not easy if you're doing it in Africa. And in our case at Yoco, given that we are, kind of a regulated financial services business that also deals with hardware, it just makes it exceptionally hard to expand on the continent. And what I want to talk a little bit about is why, or what are the things that make it really, really hard. And I'm sure some of these things apply to other regions too. But I think in the African context, they are really big barriers that need to be overcome to really make growing on the continent easy, especially in the technology space. So the first thing to understand, and if you've engaged a little bit with the continent, this of course is a bit of a platitude. But if you have not, we often talk about Africa as if it was one country or one region or homogeneous block of land. But the truth is that is not the case, right? Africa has 54 different countries. There was this map that I should have added where if you put kind of if you put America, Europe, Russia, and China all together, it's still a smaller landmass than all of Africa, right? If you want to fly from the tip of South Africa to Morocco, it's about a 10-hour flight. So it's a massive, massive, massive continent that's also massively diverse just from a country perspective. And then you add the complexity of languages, which quite closely correlates with cultures. And you're starting to see that across the continent, there are about 2,000 different languages, which means you have pretty much the same number of different cultures, if not even more. And you're very quickly, if you look at kind of some of the languages put here, this idea of kind of this homogeneous market of 1.2 billion people that you can just serve with a tap of a button, they're all going to buy your product. That kind of vision very quickly starts falling apart. If you start seeing how diverse and how fragmented the region is. And if you think about it in the context of expansion, what that means is that there is no such thing as a common market. That is changing. Don't have to go too much into detail, but there is work by the African Union happening to create a common trade area that would make this easier. But in many industries today, that's still not the case. This certainly means that across the continent, there's no common regulatory framework. So just because you get a license to do your business in one country on the continent, it doesn't mean you get it in the other. It's not like in Europe where there's license portability and you can just kind of take a lot of the stuff across borders. There's also no common purchasing power. You have areas that are really, really wealthy. You have areas that are really, really poor. Even within the same city, there's a lot of differences there. I mentioned earlier, there's no common culture. Every place has different languages, different cultures, different ways of doing things. Because of the size and the diversity, it also means that the market is a very different development stages, right? There are parts of the continent that you go to and it feels like you are in New York and your phone has 5G and there are people driving around in electric cars and you feel like you're in New York. And then there are parts of the continent that don't have electricity and all of that. So you have that whole kind of variance of development stages. And so again, it becomes very, very tricky to think of the market or the region as a common block. And then most importantly, of course, you also have this thing around there are no common ways of doing businesses because cultures are different, languages are different, histories are different. The way business is done in Nigeria is not the same as how business is done in Kenya and the other way around. And then I think to kind of compound all of that, and I'm aware I'm not painting a particularly positive picture, but I'll get back to being positive again. I think to compound all of that, if you look at the size of the individual countries' economies, they're also quite small compared to some of the developed or quote unquote developed markets, right? If you look at the GDP of Nigeria and South Africa, which are the biggest economies on the continent, it's still a smaller GDP than all of Boston. Nigeria is a country of almost 200 billion people. I don't know how many people live in Boston, but certainly not that many. 200 million, sorry. I'm not sure if I said billion, but probably would have gathered that that's a mistake. And so, you take all of these things together and you have a market, a region that is growing really, really quickly, very, very young population, lots of opportunity, but at the same time, really, really, really fragmented, and where the markets only add up relatively slowly, especially if you're coming from kind of outside of the continent, where you have cities that are bigger than some of the markets from a GDP perspective. So the challenge when you look at expansion on the continent is really a challenge of fragmentation, and fragmentation makes expansion really, 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 really hard. And I just want to talk about some of the things that kind of follow from this concept of fragmentation, and just sprinkle a little bit of experience and maybe anecdotes into this to give you a sense for what this means practically. So, the fragmentation, if you look at it from an operational perspective, what does it mean, right? It means that the complexity at the cost of doing business is very, very high. If you need to be set up in all of these markets, if you need to build collections in all of these markets, if you need to operate in all of these markets, things can be really, really, really complicated. And complying with all of the different local rules around, how to incorporate and how to manage companies it can be a nightmare. We were doing a pre-briefing with Aaron the other day, and I was telling the story how we had done some work in Egypt a while back, and there's a big culture around having physical documents that need to be stamped. And so there were many, many occasions in which we had to kind of fly to Egypt just to put a stamp on a document and then leave again, or put a fingerprint on a document and then leave again, because that's just kind of how things were signed there. There was no concept of digital signatures whatsoever. Kind of following from that, what's very important operationally is, because the markets are so different, you cannot really run your operation in a particularly centralized fashion. Because you need to be able to respond to nuances and comply with nuances, it's very important to bring strong market leadership in early, which I think is true for all expansion projects, but I think even more so in the context of the continent, because just because you made something work in South Africa doesn't mean you can just replicate it in Kenya. You really need to be on the ground. Then the other point that is becoming more and more important is this whole concept of infrastructure onshoring. So more and more markets on the continent are going the route of data sovereignty. And so you're having to deal with a lot of requests of customer information being stored locally, processed locally. But at the same time, you're dealing with the issue that, you're running on whatever, AWS or Azure, but they're not going to have a data center in Angola or in Nigeria. Then you're going to start all of a sudden having to figure out how your entire tech architecture needs to work, where part of your systems are running in the cloud, part of your systems are running on soil. And so that ends up exponentially driving up your costs, just from kind of a technical infrastructure and architecture perspective, and your complexity, of course. Other thing that becomes really painful is everything around treasury, taxing, accounting, transfer pricing. It ends up compounding dramatically. Plus, there are many markets in which you also have restrictions on foreign exchange. And so moving money in and out of the countries is really, really hard. There was a time, for example, where all or most foreign airlines just pulled out of Nigeria and Angola because it became so hard for them to repatriate their funds that they basically just ended up saying, we cannot service these markets anymore because there's no point if we cannot get our money out. And so these are just kind of some of the complexities that this fragmentation causes, and some of the things you have to think about really cleverly, or learn the very hard way if you are expanding across the continent, and just kind of figuring out how to deal with the increased cost of compliance. If you think more about kind of the go-to-market side of the story, it's very much about, you need to think about localization first, because again, you have different languages even within the same countries. So kind of language localization becomes very important very early on. But you also need to be aware that the types of phones people use are very, very different to the phones people might be using in the US or in Europe. So you're dealing with a much broader range of phones, sometimes much more lower spec, sometimes from manufacturers that are exclusively building and serving the African continent. you also have to build for different connectivity types where, there are parts that have perfect 5G, and then there are parts that barely have edge, and still your product kind of needs to work. And I remember reading this article that I found fascinating that Facebook used to do, where they would basically put their developers onto these different connectivity types to test their products, to make sure that when they're building stuff, it doesn't just work with, like a fancy fiber connection that you have in the Bay Area, but it's also going to work if somebody picks it up, in a rural part of the continent on a 2G or 3G connection. And then I think the other thing that's very important is, because the markets are relatively low trust compared to the region. Or let me put it differently: because trust is built much more face to face and much more socially. When you think about selling your product, it has to be much more face to face. And so you see many, 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 even technology companies having to build out these massive physical sales teams, because this thing of selling online and selling off Instagram and people buying your stuff online are just not that common. Even if you look at e-commerce, for example, in most countries on the continent, e-commerce works on a cash on delivery basis, because there's just not enough trust yet in the system that people would pay for something up front. And so the culture in many markets is very much around, cool, I'll order online, that's fine. But then you bring it to my door, I look at it. If I like it, I keep it and I'll pay you. If I don't like it, I'll send it back, and I've never paid for it. And it's, again, a very interesting thing to keep in mind operationally, because you're dealing with a much bigger number of returns, you're dealing with a much bigger number of, failed deliveries, because people often just shop to get to see stuff and then send it back. They've got a lot of these operational things. Or, for example, people had to come up with really clever ways of finding customers, because not all the countries, or not all parts of countries, have a super sophisticated address system. So often, a lot of delivery or these kind of services actually end up relying on either GPS coordinates or things like that. And then lastly, these lists can go on and on, but I think the other important thing that I wanted to mention is just the importance of how your brand and your marketing needs to cater for different languages, cultures, religions, sometimes even within the same country, which is, a bit of a challenge, because you're not always dealing with perfectly homogeneous regions. And so basically what that means is that if you look at kind of how companies have grown on the continent, you generally see almost like two extremes, right? You see the companies that have gone very, very deep in a very, very small number of markets, and have really kind of embraced the complexity, embraced the challenge, but then have done so in a relatively small number of markets. Or you've seen companies that have found clever ways to get around some of the complexities, and then they become relatively shallow, but very, very broad across many markets. And often that also has to do with the types of customers they serve. So, for example, you see, kind of global payment processors, they have historically scaled much faster across the continent, because they need to serve customers like Netflix or Airbnb or Apple or whatever, and they want to be in as many markets as they can. So they've often grown with their customers. Whereas companies like Yoco, for example, have been much slower at growing across the border, because our customers are local, our customers are domestic, and so we have a much bigger incentive on going deep in fewer markets instead of going broad, so we can really deeply serve the audience that we have. Cool. I think we're almost out of time, so let me just quickly touch on a few lessons that I wanted to close out with, and then I see the couple of questions in the chat as well. But I think a few things that have kind of come up over the years that I wanted to mention, and I hope are insightful. I think one thing that's become very, very clear, and those of you who've been exposed to the continent probably know this, the continent is all about personal relationships and personal trust. people do business with people they know, and people work better with you if they know you. And so what's really important here is that business on the continent is done with the people on the ground. And so if you're trying to get somebody to do something via email, it just doesn't work. Sometimes you just have to step on a plane, go see people, and that is by far the best way of getting stuff done. Sometimes frustrating, but it is what it is. It is how business is done here, and it's very important to keep that in mind. Secondly, I think bringing in local insights as early as possible and understanding the nuances of each market makes the world of a difference. And so, you cannot figure out your Africa strategy, or even your Nigeria strategy, or even your Lagos strategy without having these local insights very, very, very early on. And often it's really as simple as, being on the ground, talking to people, speaking to customers, getting insights from them, and then understanding what are the nuances that make things that make people trust you. And then I think one thing that's been very important for us is that because of all these challenges that we've highlighted, right? Expanding on the continent is a very, very risky endeavor. And so what's very important, and I think what's been very important for us, is making sure that we go deep in our home market and then expand from a very kind of stable and strong position in our home market, so that the attention directed at the expansion doesn't put the home market at risk. Because the projects of expanding are just never guaranteed, you want to make sure that you don't kind of put yourself at risk in the expansion markets and in your home markets, because you're basically compromising your position everywhere. So what's really important is making sure that you do expand from a place of strength, because that's going to give you a lot more runway and a lot more peace in going down that road. And lastly, I think what we're also learning more and more is just this concept of being very pragmatic about stuff sometimes. And, wherever you can, also try and partner to reduce the time and the cost of entering markets. You can always go the complicated route further down the road, but sometimes it's just good to get started and get going, even if it means you partner and you share revenue and whatever it might be, and then kind of build out your approach from there. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to mention that I've learned along the way, and I hope this was useful and interesting. And I know we're almost out of time, so I want to make a bit of time for questions as well. But I hope this was a useful overview of the art and joy of expanding on the continent.